Merry Halloween, my fellow tricksters. Looks like I will be doing a spooky season special this year. And what better way of doing this than to review and rank each Final Destination movie. It's a good time too, considering that a 6th movie is currently in development, so I decided to do this in anticipation for it. I actually wanted to do this in 2020 for Halloween, but due to certain circumstances I couldn't. And the same with 2021, so now I'm doing it. Why Final Destination? Well, it's because no reason really, other than maybe because Final Destination was the first horror movie I actually ended up liking. And I was a kid when I first watched the first Final Destination, and I was so enthralled and scared by the concept of death killing the characters that it just stuck with me. I mean, they even named one of the most popular stages in Super Smash Bros. After it. No, they didn't. That's a lie. Don't take it seriously. So, let's go right ahead and get started with Final Destination 1. Final Destination 1 is an okay entry to the franchise. It definitely made an impact and it did spawn an entire series of films to follow it up, so clearly it did something right. This film to me feels the most like a horror film than a supernatural slasher, and it doesn't look modern either compared to the later entries. It's a product of its time. You can tell because these actors are supposed to be playing high school students. Nowadays, you actually have actors that look like the age they're supposed to play, but back then you could have a 20-something-year-old play a character who still has to take a school bus to go to school. However, the acting itself isn't really all that bad. I mean, I don't expect Oscar award-winning performances in a B movie. As for the story itself, the best thing about this film that differentiates itself from the other ones is that it actually also edges into murder mystery in the sense that the protagonist, the guy who foresees the initial disaster that saves everyone's lives, is actually being framed for the deaths that occur. It's like death itself just wants to be a dick to Alex, and while he's doing his job of killing everyone, he decides to manipulate the circumstances to make it seem like Alex is a serial killer. It's an interesting twist that adds tension to the film instead of just the audience anticipating the next death from these freak accidents. Although perhaps I give Death too much credit, because most of this is really Alex's fault. He really does do the dumbest things that make him suspicious, and it's almost frustrating seeing him try to fix things but bumbling his way through them. But I understand that he probably feels responsible for the deaths and he wants to prevent other people from dying, and he is supposed to be a high schooler, so acting this way is acceptable, I suppose. And speaking of deaths, the main gimmick of the film franchise is how death kills its victims as a force that starts a chain of events, like a Rube Goldberg machine type effect like I mentioned, complicated machinations that result in a pretty simple thing. And I think the scariest ones are the ones that seem more likely to happen to you in real life. For example, the incident that triggers it all, the plane explosion. Now, while planes crashing is a very rare case, and a plane exploding mid-flight really early after takeoff is even more rare, I would think that it's even unheard of, I think watching that scene will still trigger some sort of response to any buried fear of flying. It may even trigger a fight or flight response. But seriously, as unrealistic as this plane explosion is in hindsight, I doubt people would be comfortable watching this film during a flight. Well, maybe if you're a psychopath. So the plane explodes, but it's a premonition, and he gets everyone off the plane, and now everyone survives, and of course the protagonist is deemed suspicious because he got everyone off right before the plane was about to explode, and he predicted it. Also, check out this guy's name.
I'm Agent Ween, this is Agent Shrek.
So as I've said, Alex kinda gets framed for the murders, and the detectives are obviously suspicious of him and they interrogate him. The only reason I want to mention this scene is because it kind of irks me how people actually do talk to the detectives without a lawyer. I know in real life people do that, especially if they're innocent, but I think it needs to be more common knowledge that if you're detained by the police, you really do have the right to remain silent, and that anything you say can and will be used against you. But I guess it wouldn't really make for an interesting scene if Alex did exercise his right to remain silent. So I gotta give credit to the scene for putting Alex in the hot seat and getting him to talk and possibly incriminate himself, even if it is frustrating to watch. Hey, if characters do everything perfectly and the way they should, movies would be pretty boring. Anyways, the movie's pacing overall is pretty good, I would say. It builds up to the plane explosion at the beginning without dragging it out, and when the incident appears, the story progresses pretty well and none of the scenes ever felt unnatural. We get to spend enough time with our protagonist and some of the characters, and we also see the effects, including the psychological effects, of escaping death and how it affects everyone else. We don't really get a lot of character moments for a lot of them, and appropriately, the ones we don't really get to know that well are killed off really suddenly and unceremoniously. I think it's pretty cool that we only see the complicated cause and effect deaths to the characters who have a bit more depth to the characters that we see on screen. Todd is Alex's close friend and he's like a bro and he's got his back all the time. Valerie is a teacher who feels enormous guilt and is the most affected psychologically by the plane explosion, which we see before her death. Carter speedruns through the 5 stages of grief, and Clear is very obviously Alex's love interest and turns from a loner and insecure person to one who can open up to others, and this is reflected in how her hair changes from brunette to her natural hair color. And while we're on the topic of Clear Rivers, I would say that Ali Larter has the best performance in this film out of all the other actors. Though I still kinda dislike her scenes with Alex, and the romance between them feels really awkward, so it's hard to feel anything for them. Moving on to the deaths. The deaths in this film are pretty mild, I would say. I'd say that the most ludicrous death was Billy's when he was decapitated by a piece of shrapnel that was struck by a fucking chain beneath a train. That sentence itself just sounds really weird. It's not just the freak accident nature of this that's wild, but Billy's little decoration as he stood next to the train that had just almost killed Carter. Like, he makes a point to stay away from him to save himself as he stands right next to the train tracks. But the funniest scene in this movie is definitely the cabin scene.
Overlooked it. You tried to capitalize, but I caught you. You fuck. I could beat you. Yeah, maybe not forever. But I got this cabin rigged to beat you now.
This film, as corny as it can get, is charming in a way, and I enjoy it. So while Final Destination 1 is rather subdued for the most part, it's how it maintains its own identity from the rest of the series. So Final Destination 1 gets a 6 out of 10.
But it was the events after the crash that turned this tragic story into something even stranger. The survivors who managed to get off the plane before it crashed died.
Final Destination 2 started the trend of extending the Rube Goldberg machine-style killing that Death employs into the inciting incident, whereas in Final Destination 1 is just an explosion with some parts of it showing how some of the characters died. Now we get a whole ass scene that shows people getting eviscerated in the opening accident. And Final Destination 2 probably has the best of them in the entire series. Well, maybe 5, but we'll talk about that later. At the very least, this freeway incident is definitely the most legendary. The highway scene with the logging truck has become so iconic that people today still probably get freaked out when they see a truck like this one on the freeway. It is truly a spectacle to watch, and for me is one of the best car crash scenes in film, even if it is really exaggerated at parts. What makes the scene great, actually, is the lack of music up until the end of it. It somehow makes the crash feel more real and intense, and allows the audio to be dedicated purely to the brutality of it. After watching this, you realize that this film will be much more insane than the first one, and it is indeed a worthy sequel. One more note about the freeway scene is how chaotic it is, yet it actually rewards you if you're really perceptive and pay close attention and realize that we never saw the pregnant woman die, which becomes a major plot point later in the film. So how is Final Destination 2 as a whole? It's as fast as the vehicles on the freeway. While Final Destination 1 took its time to get to the plane explosion, Final Destination 2 wastes no time getting to the crash scene. We are already in the freeway by the 5.5 minute mark. For comparison, in Final Destination 1, they start boarding the plane at the 10 minute mark, so the pacing overall is fast. But while this film does follow many plot beats as the first one, the decision to make the survivors all complete strangers was a really good one. It's a different dynamic between the characters, and because Final Destination movies follow a general story structure and theme, any changes made to the original formula is almost always acceptable. Another change they made is how Death is working backwards in this one, and they justify it okay, I guess, since it also gives them a reason to include Clear Rivers, which is also a decision that I'm fond of. So the film pulls a sneaky Anya and just straight up kills off her friends, so we spend the entire film with the other strangers, which is definitely why the film wastes no time getting to know Kimberly and her friends before the incident, because it wouldn't have mattered anyway if we got to know them. Anyways, I really don't get why Kimberly is so mad at Clear Rivers here. Clear has literally no stake in any of this and has no reason to help her, yet Kimberly acts as if it's her responsibility to leave her safe room and help everyone. I don't know, it just kind of bothers me. In the previous film, we got Tony Todd explaining to the characters what is happening. In this one, we get another cameo from him, and a neat thing they decided to add to this film is a way to actually beat Death and stop him from harassing the cast. While it's neat at first, I'm beginning to wonder why he didn't tell Clear and Alex in the first movie if he already knew. Oh, fun fact. But did you know that there's an alternate ending in Final Destination 1 that takes advantage of this? Alex and Clear canoodled with each other on the lakeshore, and Alex died when he saved Clear, but Clear gave birth to Alex's child later on, which freed her and Carter from death. So apparently one of the ways to beat death is to have one of the survivors have a child. Basically, life will counteract the death. However, the concept of giving birth after you were supposed to die doesn't make sense if you think about it. If a pregnant lady was supposed to die, but she still gives birth, shouldn't that mean that the child will also be targeted by death because he wasn't meant to be alive? I don't know, maybe that's just me, but it doesn't really make sense. Like, that child should not exist, right? So, what the hell? So, Kim, Clear, and the cop dude decide to be with the other survivors so that they can work together to beat death, which is kind of interesting because in this one they get everyone working together in the middle of the film. Oh, and check out this guy. He has the most hilarious line delivery in this film.
What the fuck are you thinking?
I'm thinking sucking my junk, biatch.
Okay, what a fucking tool. If the cabin speech was the unintentionally funniest performance in Final Destination 1, then this one-liner is it for this film. By the way, what is up with this sexually fired up elevator scene between junkie Ian Hecox and this random NPC character? Was this scene supposed to be a tension reliever before the mom's death scene where she gets decapitated by the elevator? I don't know, this scene just felt so out of place to me, and I feel like if it was removed, it wouldn't really change much. So after the mom's head gets popped off, there's a scene with Eugene, and I actually really like it. This is honestly how I would expect someone to realistically react if they were in this situation. Like, everyone's reactions to finding out that death is chasing them and they will die is strangely subdued and mild. And the gun having all of its ammo being duds when he tried to shoot himself really hammers in how their lives are literally in death's hands. I just really like this scene.
You don't keep it loaded?
They're all duds.
6 in a row? Never. That's impossible.
It wasn't his turn to die.
And in another scene soon after, we get the connections between these characters and the characters in Final Destination 1, and it doesn't really feel cheap when they tie the two films together. In addition to the previous scene I mentioned, this scene also serves to make Death as this intricate designer who was trying to fix his plans when Alex fucked it all up in the first one. Because of how they connect the two films, you get rewarded for watching these two movies one after another. And these two movies are the ones that feel the most interconnected with each other as opposed to the rest of the series. However, while the movie tries to use this to explain why Death is working backwards, it again doesn't really make sense why. Even if Death is working backwards, it won't tie up the loose ends. The longer these characters are left alive, the stronger the butterfly effect will be, and the order in which they die wouldn't really make too much of a difference. But who knows, I don't know how death works in this film, so maybe it knows more than I give it credit for. Who the hell cares, I'm just a random person on the internet. I think I know what junkie Ian Hecox's role is in this film. He had the weird elevator scene, which I guess is kinda funny, and his last scene with him asking Kimberly to do a favor, to get rid of the stuff that'll upset his mom after he dies, really adds in a touch of emotion to this film. It's a nice contrast to the scene with Eugene unable to accept being part of Death's current design. Rory, on the other hand, has accepted that he's gonna get off, and he's making preparations for it. It's honestly a little heartwarming, and you kinda feel bad for him. Rory, I think, is supposed to be the most human out of all of them, based on this scene alone. A flawed person who's looking back on his life, and I felt him in that scene with him and Kimberly. Or maybe I'm just overthinking it. It's just a dumb supernatural slasher horror film, right? Anyways, the climax of the film goes just as fast as the initial incident with the freeway. It has to wrap up, so after Kat's death, the remaining deaths happen quickly, and then we get Kimberly figuring out how to stop everything. She kills herself by driving to the lake, which ruins Death's plans since she was the last one in line, and so spares everyone who was supposed to die before her. She gets revived, but it counts as dying anyways, so her and the police dude both live. All of this happens so fast, however, that it mostly feels like an ass pull and out of nowhere. And when the cop says,
Thanks to you, we cheated death.
you first go, huh? What? How did they do that? So yeah, the ending is pretty rushed, but it sort of makes up for it by having the funniest last shot out of all the Final Destination movies. I feel like this film was a bit more fun than the first one. 6.5 out of 10. Final Destination 3 is not very good. One of the biggest flaws in the film is actually its setup and the incident that gets everyone killed. So in this film, they all die from a roller coaster accident. While the scene itself is done pretty well and allows the audience to get a feel of being on a roller coaster, the entire thing falls apart when the only reason the accident occurs is because of Frankie Cheek's camera. Without it, the roller coaster would not have gone catastrophic. Yes, the hydraulics line was still leaking, but it was the camera that caused it to completely snap. The rails were loose, but only because it came undone when part of the car Lewis was on bounced off him. And what caused this? The camera. Now, I read on the Final Destination wiki that Frankie's camera only really caused the deaths of everyone who was in the back half of the roller coaster, and they got off anyways. So the people who stayed would have died because those cars flying off wasn't caused by Frankie Cheek's camera, but it definitely seems like the wheels only flew off because of it. Oh, and I love how Wendy doesn't even make an attempt to get her boyfriend off the roller coaster until after she's left the area and the ride starts. But whatever, that's not the only problem with this film. A lot of the characters in this one are just dicks. The protagonist, Wendy, is a bit of a bitch, but to be fair, she's the most emotionally distraught out of all of them, so her attitude is understandable, but everyone else is very unlikable. Next, we've got two mean girls named Ashlyn and Ashley, a douchebag jock, Ian McKinley, who for some reason gets angry at the protagonist even though she tried to warn them, and who is also a future serial killer with how he fucking murders a pigeon for fun. We also have sexual harasser Jeff Bezos, and Wendy's sister, and Aaron, both of who we don't really care about. The only person who is like annoying or an asshole is Kevin, but he's whatever. Despite the unlikable characters, the actresses' performances are okay. Mary Elizabeth Winstead is obviously the best one here. She's honestly a great actress, but not even she can save this film.
SpongeBob lives underwater.
It's so sad that you know that.
You know what? Watching this film, now that I think about it, maybe in some way the characters all being detestable works best because when they die, maybe we feel happy? I don't know, I'm trying to find good things in this film, to be honest. What else is good in this film? We see boobies, I guess. That's fun, people like that, right? But Wendy's camera being an important part of the plot and in figuring out how each of the characters die is a new idea that is really reminiscent of that Goosebumps book, Say Cheese and Die. And while a lot of the film fumbles with its inconsistent storytelling, the deaths are at the very least pretty great and brutal, especially the tanning bed scene. Speaking of which, let's talk about them quickly because they're the best parts about this film. The tanning bed scene is definitely a highlight of the film, and the most brutal, probably one of the most gruesome in the entire franchise. And they were practically nude, so they probably felt even more helpless and vulnerable. Next is Frankie's death, which honestly has a nice presentation, and I'm kinda glad he dies before he assaults a woman. Afterwards is Lewis, whose death is pretty comical. He was the standard denier douchebag, so I was kinda glad to see him go. Now that I think about it, everyone in this film doesn't believe Wendy or Kevin, unlike the previous films where they had some people believing the protagonist and even working together in the second film. It's also hilarious how Ian and Aaron deny Wendy and Kevin's warnings, and Ian even says how death is a natural part of life, but when Aaron gets nailed, he's all pissy about it. Though he does contribute to a theory on how to save them and ruin Death's plan. If the person who was last in line committed suicide, it would stop Death's plan. It's interesting, but we learned earlier that you can't kill yourself if it's not your turn to die yet, and the next movie hammers that in even more, so whatever. I also love how one of the people who got off the roller coaster is a character who doesn't even have a single line in the entire film, and we know literally nothing about her. She is practically a background character, and I don't know why she's even in this film, nor why she has this role. Also, do you know she's the only survivor in the franchise who isn't African American or Caucasian? So Wendy's sister, Julie, survives before being lacerated by the Harrows, and that Asian chick I mentioned gets impaled by a flagpole. Then Death loops back around and kills Ian with a cherry picker. As rushed as these deaths are, they are still at least somewhat cinematic, or they look pretty cool, I guess. As bonkers as they are. The film wraps up with her having a premonition of a train derailing, and it ends with them trying to stop the train as the screen fades to black, which I think is probably the most boring and uninspiring ending of a Final Destination film, though I gotta give it to the filmmakers for creating another large-scale accident to kill off the remaining characters, and for using a train no less. But that's about it for Final Destination 3, I don't have anything else to say about it. But there is one thing to note. Because the first time I watched this as a kid was actually on DVD, and it had a special feature called Choose Their Fate. In this one, much like a Choose Your Own Adventure story, the audience can select what happens during certain scenes. This is probably why I like this film initially, because of how much I like the concept of choosing your own adventure in film, but as a film itself, it kind of falls flat. Despite how bad this film is overall compared to the others, it still isn't the worst one. And in some way, it's still entertaining to watch. It's apparently considered a fan favorite, and it spawned a cult-like fan base, so it did something right. But rated the film only, as I would with the other ones, Final Destination 3 gets a 4 out of 10.
Have you all lost your fucking mind?
This movie is awful. It has everything wrong that the previous films had and adds in more things that are uninspired. Plus, it includes new things to add to the list. One of these is the fact that it falls victim to the 3D trend that was going on at the time. There are so many shots that are so much worse than they needed to be simply because the filmmakers wanted to take advantage of the stereoscopic images. And I know and remember this well because The Final Destination was the first film in the series I actually watched in theaters, and it was one of the 3D showings. It was fun and looked cool at the time, but watching it now without those effects, it just looks bad. In fact, the CGI and special effects are also bad in general. Yes, the previous films had some bad effects as well, but I don't expect fucking Marvel levels of VFX here. They were enjoyable and bad, but nowhere near as offensive as this film. Just the racetrack accident alone is a testament of how awful it is. Speaking of the racetrack incident, this one feels the most forced in how it kills off its characters in the premonition. The previous films at least made some sense that people would die. Plane explosion? Yeah, you expect everyone to die in there. Freeway accident? Well, yeah, considering that it was caused by a stack of logs getting loose, it's exaggerated, but you can suspend your disbelief in that one. Roller coaster accident? Yeah, of course, everyone in it would die. But if a car crashes on a racetrack, fine, the tire and maybe a car would fly into the crowd. It's happened before, and the structure's unsound, so yeah, it's fine if they die when it collapses. However, it's hard to accept that cars and debris still continue to fly into the crowd long after the initial accident. The pacing of this film is also terrible. It feels very rushed. It's the shortest Final Destination film, clocking in at 82 minutes, yet it tries to put so much more into the plot than its predecessors. There are good things about this movie, however, and a lot of it isn't even part of the actual film. The opening credits are pretty damn awesome if you ask me, and I'm not afraid to say it. I really like how we get these animated recreations of past deaths in the franchise, but in X-ray vision. It's definitely pleasant on the visuals. I usually hate extended opening sequences like this. The first one that comes to mind that I also enjoy is Deadpool, but The Final Destination also passes in that regard. Again, it's not really part of the film, however, so it's unfortunate that it doesn't make up for the rest of its shittiness. So let's dive into it. This film decides to mix up its characters a bit by having the survivors both be a small group of friends and a bunch of strangers. That's one thing I like so far, besides the opening credits. We have a general boy as our protagonist, a douchebag version of Channing Tatum, budget Monica Geller, and the generic protagonist's girlfriend as our group of friends. And none of them are really interesting at all.
People didn't have a Dr. Xavier with them to tell them to get out of the way?
Wait, what? Are you referring to Professor X from the X-Men? As far as I'm aware, Professor Xavier can't see into the future, he just reads people's minds. This movie isn't even good at making references. Joining this group of friends as survivors are a MILF, a racist, a sad man, and the token black guy, who, if I had to pick a favorite, is him.
Well, nobody lives forever.
Negro?
Hey, there's no need for that.
You know, I think we need more racist characters in these type of films. So on top of the CGI being bad, they decided to turn these visions the protagonist gets into full-out animated sequences in order to take advantage of the stereoscopic effects. And it is hard to take it seriously because of how silly it looks. Look at this. This looks like a final project of an art graduate. Just as this film starts to really take a nosedive, the first real death scene occurs. And honestly, it's kind of funny. This is probably one of the funniest deaths in the series that's funny on purpose. I think this film is really trying to be as campy as it can be, and I guess I gotta give it credit for that.
If you're right about this whole crash thing, then I'm going to make the most of every moment I have left. So I'm going to do what I do best. I'm going to go get laid.
Well, at least this guy knows what he wants. But I really dislike these unnecessary sex scenes. You could cut out the scene and it wouldn't really change anything. So Nick, the protagonist, and Lori, the chick, go back to the speedway so that Nick can try to remember the order at which everyone died in his vision, and I actually like how he has to piece this together himself. In the previous films, they either have the order given to them, or the protagonist can somehow remember perfectly the order in which they die. And in this one, Nick actually has trouble remembering it, and has to rely on security camera footage. That's one more thing I think I like in this film, I guess. I don't know, I feel like I'm scavenging for scraps here. Okay, after 4 films, I gotta ask, but are any of the buildings in these film series ever inspected? Yeah, I know that death is making shit happen and stuff, but not even taking that into account, there are a lot of serious safety hazards everywhere. The repair garage is an obvious example, but why is this hair salon so neat looking, yet no one noticed the ceiling fan coming loose? Whatever. So this security guard gets a nice little backstory revealed to us about how he's a recovering alcoholic who is responsible for getting his family killed in a drunk driving incident. It's just too bad that this scene where he delivers that story feels so bland and lacking emotion.
Well, I guess it's not my turn to die. Y'all take care.
Okay, who edited this movie? That pacing was terrible. So now it's Hunt and Janet's turn to die, and I find it funny how the chain that starts Janet's death is her being nice to a homeless person and giving him spare change, and Hunt's is him being a dick to a kid, and both of them involve a coin to some extent. Wait a minute, hang on a minute. Near the beginning of the film, Hunt flips a coin and asks Janet for heads or tails. He says he likes head, which is a sex joke, yes, but when Dick catches it and puts it down, we later see that it's tails, and so Hunt ends up dying while Janet survives. Because he lost the coin toss. Was that intentional? Oh well. Well, not like it matters because Janet dies later anyways. Speaking of which, I think Hunt's death is one of the most creatively violent yet simple deaths in the franchise. Something about it really stuck to me about how gory it is and the fact that it happens out in the open yet hidden from view. Like this happens in a public pool. His fucking organs get sucked out from his anus. That is brutal AF. Sadly, most of the film is just doing the bare minimum of what it takes to make a Final Destination movie. At least it's actually somewhat trying to be goofy. Between the bad CGI, the boring characters, and the lack of new elements from its predecessors, I would say that The Final Destination is what an early first draft of any feature films in the franchise could be. There are some neat ideas in the death scenes here and there, but most of the focus was put into making the film jump out at you and steer you with bad VFX rather than telling a good story. The car wash scene is also kinda creative, right? I guess? But does being in a car wash really interfere with cell phone signals this much? I don't know, maybe they did in 2009. Despite most of the film being pretty bad, the script does get a bit better in the second half, if only slightly. Adding the twist that one of the original victims actually did survive but was just stuck under the rubble was honestly kinda clever, and I did like how in the second Final Destination film, there was that one scene with Eugene trying to kill himself but unable to because it was not yet his time. This film takes that and pushes it a bit, and does make for a somewhat funny scene.
What the fuck are you doing, man? Why are you trying to kill yourself?
I'm just trying to give God what I thought he wanted. I've been trying to kill myself all day.
The mall explosion is also neat, I would say. It makes you forget how bad the first half of the film is, but discount Courtney Cox is still super annoying. And in this film, she's the one who has the unironically funniest line.
I was meant to see this movie.
Oh, thank God, she's dead. I really like how Laurie's leg gets crushed by the escalator mechanism, and yet she immediately starts vomiting blood. I didn't know a leg injury could make you bleed like that. And it turns out that the ball incident was another premonition, and Nick manages to stop the explosion from occurring, and he's kind of like a hero, but it turns out all that was a red herring, and they all get run over by an isekai truck. All things considered, this film does have the coolest looking ending sequence out of all of the films. Remember how I said that I really liked the opening credits and their X-ray style animation? Well, they actually used that as part of the film. This might be a sudden and abrupt ending to some people, but I just needed something to latch on at this point. I just want to enjoy this scene. And with that, The Final Destination gets a grand score of 3 out of 10. Final Destination 5 is surprisingly good. It's not by any means an amazing horror film, but with how the previous 2 films have gone, this one is a significant improvement. And one of the reasons is that the characters are better in this one than most of the others. We've got less punchable face Ben Shapiro, budget Tom Cruise, 2 love interests, another sex appeal character, another pervert who happens to look like a pedophile, the dude from The Office, and our token black guy. While the characters are a bit of an improvement, the film also does some other things well. To start, the bridge collapse scene is up there with the freeway scene in Final Destination 2. And it's from here you can tell that the VFX is better than the previous film. It's still not the best there is, like there are some terrible CGI parts that could have been done better with practical, but that's mostly when they try to take advantage of the stereoscopic imagery, and also when the CGI involves human remains. Not only that, but the entire sequence itself is really thrilling. In previous incidents, the characters were mostly confined to a vehicle or a seat or whatever, but in this one, the characters are put into an action sequence where they're actually trying to actively escape the danger. Okay, yeah, the Final Destination did something similar, but we already talked about how dumb the speedway scene is. It's also kinda cool how instead of the survivors just straight up avoiding the tragedy altogether, they just get a few seconds head start and still have to escape the danger. It's like those few seconds made a huge difference. After the incident, we can see that Final Destination 5 is a return to form of what made the first film stand out. The protagonist, Sam, is deemed suspicious by a detective, and while I'm still annoyed at how much he's talking with him, I kinda took it for granted. It adds more tension and stakes besides dying to freak accidents sort of thing. But what I like about this film is that it refines that concept, and instead of the protagonist being an idiot and doing suspicious shit, the detective also sides with him a little bit to figure out the mystery. Additionally, they bring back Tony Todd as William Bloodworth, who has been missing in the past 2 films. And I'd say that he was utilized fairly well in this film. He kinda has a role to play, and he sort of guides the characters and gives them information about how death works. Oh, and we get more characterization in this film. Yay! We see that Sam is a chef and has dreams of going to Paris for an apprenticeship, but he's conflicted with this because he wants to stay behind for his ex-girlfriend. Okay, whatever. We get this scene of him at his job and how a customer sends back his dish saying it was bland, but then his chef defends him. It's these nice little moments that make us care for the characters besides the typical I love you motive, which personally for me is something I'm not a big fan of.
That customer is an asshole. The bourguignon is good.
Admittedly though, I appreciate the complexity behind his and Molly's character. How Sam doesn't want to leave her behind, but Molly wants him to go after his dreams. Then we also have Peter, aka Discount Tom Cruise, who becomes unhinged after losing his girlfriend, and he acts as the secondary antagonist, but we'll get to that later. The death scenes in this film go kinda hard. They somehow have way more tension and suspense than in the previous films. Even if you know what's gonna happen next, I found myself actually cringing in anticipation for these scenes, but in a good way. I've noticed that since Final Destination 2, there has always been a scene where characters in a beauty salon or a medical room where they are strapped or confined to something and can't move. In Final Destination 2, there was the dentist scene. In 3, there was the tanning bed. In 4, there was a salon, and in this one, the filmmakers decided to go fuck it, full throttle, no brakes, and we get a laser eye surgery scene. Oh, and don't forget the massage scene with the acupuncture. While I like how they went for this with the laser eye surgery, it kinda feels unoriginal on how they set things up. It's always water that gets some equipment wet and makes it malfunction, and the victim is always left alone with dangerous equipment, but I suppose it's hard to get around that. Similarly with the dentist scene from Final Destination 2 or the salon scene from the previous film, or even the massage scene earlier, the main part is always a fake out before getting killed by something somewhat unrelated, like a glass pane, or a rock, or a Buddha statue. I like the tanning bed scene because those characters actually die from the tanning bed.
I've got my eye on you two.
A major addition to the story is a new way of escaping death, or at least delaying it. Final Destination 5 introduces the concept of murdering someone to take their lifespan. In other words, PvP is now enabled in Final Destination. If you survived an incident that was supposed to kill you, you can instead kill someone else to take your place, and you will inherit their remaining lifespan. This is where the unhinged budget Tom Cruise comes in. He is so affected by his girlfriend's death and decides to take action to take Molly's lifespan. This simple plot element adds another threat while also increasing the stakes a little bit. It's just a damn shame that it isn't utilized until the climax. Well, there's that other murder by Nathan as well, but overall the film could have really expanded on this concept. The final scene of the film reveals that this film actually takes place before the first Final Destination film, which is an interesting twist to be honest, so I can't really complain. It is a bit irritating that there are no survivors left over, however. I get that in every film there really were no survivors except for the second one, but it really could have been nice to have at least Nathan survive. Everyone dying is kind of getting old and it makes the film a bit predictable. Oh, and the film ends off with a montage of deaths from the previous films, but with added CGI for the 3D effects in the theaters. But I don't think it really takes away from the film because it only happens after it's already ended. I know this one was somewhat short, but there's not much for me to pick apart. It's a pretty good film by Final Destination standards, and there's a lot of innovation that the filmmakers went for, as opposed to the previous 2 films. It's a good entry to the series and adds fresh ideas. However, it could have done with take advantage of these new concepts further. It is still very rough around the edges, but it's quite enjoyable. 7 out of 10. Alright, now we've covered Final Destination 1 to 5. It's time to rank them in order. Here are the rankings for every Final Destination deaths. Yes, we're gonna rank each death. E tier. These ones are the rather boring ones. They're quick and uninteresting. Perry Malinowski, the only survivor without a speaking role and is pretty much an NPC. It's fitting that her death just kinda happens. Samantha Lane. Dies when a lawnmower hits a rock and propels it to her after making a pun. Everything before the salon was just a red herring, but is still mildly uninteresting, and this death is made even worse because they spoiled it in the trailers. Nadia Monroy. Same as above. It starts off the film, but is also spoiled by the trailers. Andy Accuser. There is a fake out with the car, but he is struck by a flying CO2 tank. The reason why this one is an E tier is not only because it's boring, but it assumes that the human body has no bones in it. George Lanette gets run over by an ambulance. Nothing else to be said. Dano Estevez, Frankie Whitman, and Shina McClank hit by a truck and killed in the SUV explosion in the beginning of Final Destination 2. It's whatever. This kind of death can happen in any movie. Nathan Sears gets crushed by Flight 180 landing gear. I feel like this one didn't need to happen. There's nothing wrong with having a survivor in these films, and it sort of ruins the concept of taking another person's life by removing the payoff. Terry Cheney gets run over by a bus. I almost put this one in the tier above because it at least had a funny line right before she got splattered. D tier. These ones are also mostly quick or boring like the previous tier, but they have something that gives it a bit of a bump to this tier. Carter Horton, the ending shot of Final Destination 1. This one is quick but ends the movie with the implication that they truly cannot escape death, so there is a lasting impact on the audience. Tim Carpenter gets crushed by a glass pane when he chases some pigeons away. Other than being an idiot for running into a construction zone, all the build-up before it was irrelevant. It looks pretty intense though. Kat Jennings. This one is kinda creative, but it's dumb that Kat wouldn't rest her head next to the pipe instead of in front of it. Rory Peters. This one is quick, but not as boring because of how wild it is. It loses points for being very unrealistic by Final Destination standards, so much that I think Mythbusters helped us prove that. Sam Lawton dies in the Flight 180 explosion at the end of Final Destination 5. While this is boring, the fact that it connects it to the first film is worth mentioning. Peter Friedkin gets impaled with a bead spit. It's boring, but one of the two deaths caused purely by another person instead of death. Jim Block, same as above. Jim wasn't a survivor and was just killed by Peter. Both of these deaths are somewhat interesting because they're pretty much just murdering each other to survive. Murdering people is fun as long as it's in fiction. Brian Gibbons gets blown up by a barbecue's propane tank. C tier. These ones largely stop being bad and become a bit entertaining or have some sort of flair and presentation to them. Roy Carson gets impaled through his head via chin. It's quick, but it's up there because it was a joint effort between Death and Nathan Sears putting Roy in the crossfires. Jonathan Groves, the cowboy from the Final Destination. His death is kind of funny for how relatively simple the setup was. That's the only reason it makes it the C tier. Billy Hitchcock. He's decapitated by car wreckage, and while it is out of nowhere, it does have some presentation with how it was shown. Luis Romero. There's a good amount of build up, and how he's killed off is creative. And it's also a little funny because of how alpha male douchebaggy he gets in the end. Ian McKinley. Crushed by a cherry picker. This one is kinda cool because of how the fireworks were set up at the beginning of the whole scene, and then firing and missing him was a cool looking fake out. Oh, and he dies flipping them off. Dennis Lapman. The office dude gets fucking headshotted by a wrench. It's sudden but in a good way, and it's a little bit funny in the context of the scene it's in. Clear Rivers and Eugene Dix. This one is just an explosion, but it's clever in how it baits you into thinking that they've avoided death, but Death just improvises and manages to take out two people at once. Molly Harper. She gets bisected by a plane wing while in the air. That's fucking hardcore. B tier. These ones are the more freak accident nature incidents that the franchise is known for. Julie and Wendy Christensen and Kevin Fisher. They died at a train accident at the end of Final Destination 3. I just put them together because they're killed off in quick succession, and the sequence is like one would expect to see at the beginning of a Final Destination film, so it's pretty unique. Frankie Cheeks. It's a quick death, but there's some setup with Wendy and Kevin being pinned in the drive-thru by a truck, and another truck coming down the hill to push an engine fan into Frankie's head. When I first saw this as a child, I was in awe and started giggling because of how insane and sudden it was. Nora Carpenter, decapitated by an elevator. This scene is pretty intense and you just know that she's fucking done for when the doors close in on her head. Hunt Wynorski. This one is one of my personal favorites because it takes place in public, yet also hidden. It's just so violent, like he gets disemboweled through the anus by a pool drain. Janet Cunningham, Laurie Milligan, and Nick O'Bannon. This one is an outlier. I just think this one is cool because they decided to do a skeleton animation sequence for these deaths. Candace Hooper. Man, this one is just brutal. It's quick, but it also makes you cringe because similar but not as fatal things have happened to gymnasts. There was one I saw where a gymnast's knees bent backwards and this scene just reminded me of that. A tier. These ones are the elaborate Rube Goldberg machine type deaths that the franchise is also known for, or the freak accident types that go on for a bit longer. Isaac Palmer dies while getting a massage. That's funny to think about. Olivia Castle, the dreaded laser eye surgery incident. I like how she's actually killed because of the teddy bear eye and by the window being so fragile, but the entire sequence is pretty epic. Aaron Ulmer, knocked back and impaled through the head several times by a nail gun. This death happened because of the initial setup where the forklift was inadvertently turned on, and I think that whole thing was pretty cool. Todd Wagner, a simple slip and he's dead. It's not over elaborate, but the scene lasts for so long and it's so painful to watch. And finally, S tier. The best deaths because they are elaborate, planned out, or are absolutely brutal. It's just the most entertaining ones. Evan Lewis. This one is creative and unique to the series in that it sounds like something that could actually happen in real life. It gets extra points for the spaghetti being the true killer in this scene. Don't toss food outside the window. Valerie Newton. A freak accident chain of events that caused her death. It's the gold standard for Rube Goldberg machine deaths. Carter Daniels. This one takes the concept of chain events and puts a comedic twist on it. Also, he's racist and he dies trying to do something fucked up to a black guy's lawn, so you don't feel as bad for him. Ashley Freund and Ashlyn Halperin. Nothing else needs to be said. This scene is fucked up and probably the worst way to die in the entire franchise. And there you have it, every Final Destination death rank. Thank you for watching this video and I hope you enjoyed it. Okay, I'll rank the movies, but it's already obvious because there are only 5 and I gave each of them a different score. Number 5, The Final Destination. From the bad VFX to unoriginal story to the bad Speedway incident sequence, The Final Destination suffers from lack of originality or interesting characters. It had the best final shots and a few interesting deaths, but this one is still the worst. Number 4, Final Destination 3. This one is also bad for its lack of new ideas, but unlike The Final Destination, this one is bad in a good way. It's entertaining and the deaths are really good, but a lot of characters are still unlikable. Number 3, Final Destination 1. This is considered the benchmark for average Final Destination. They're either better or worse in this one. While it's a good start to the franchise by creating a new idea, other films have improved on it. Honestly, I say both this and the next one are almost on the same level. Number 2, Final Destination 2. While this one is tied with Final Destination 5 for the best opening death sequence, it still pales in comparison to it. It introduces some new concepts and actually does give survivors a good ending where they escape death, and it's also tied to the first one the most out of all the other ones. And finally, number 1, Final Destination 5. It gets creative and further expands on death's rules and gives the survivors a way out that involves putting each other in conflict. I like situations where characters have to kill each other against their own will to survive, but this film didn't utilize the idea enough. And the death scenes were also not even bad at all. Oh, and let's not forget the bridge scene, which is also pretty epic. There you have it, my personal opinion on every Final Destination movie up until the 5th one, and how they stack up against each other. This was actually kind of fun, and going back to watch the first horror movie I've ever enjoyed and its sequels was an interesting experience and it gave me a new perspective on them. Again, I hope you enjoyed this, and leave behind a comment if you agree or disagree with my points. Thank you for watching, and hope to see you in the next one.